Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be back with you. I have thoroughly been enjoying my time here, and I'm already looking forward to coming back again. I can really understand why so many of you that I've met and spoken to here have been coming here year after year or reside here year after year. And I was sharing with Baxter Bell and others at dinner tonight how comfortable it is for me to speak here and how comforting it is to speak here knowing that I'm speaking to very like-minded individuals where I don't even know that I'm bringing something that you don't already know. But I feel very grateful to be able to articulate what I bring and in the words that I use to describe it. But there's something really profound about being able to sit with people who are devoted to your practices. I've had a daily yoga practice for about 32 years, and I know how much this has really brought to my life, and I bring these programs all around the world to many people, but not always to a group of yoga and meditation practitioners. And it's different. It's really different to bring this material here where you can feel that there is the lived experience and the tipping point of where we enter into self-knowledge, or what we sometimes call self-realization at obviously varying degrees, but a tipping point and a deep devotion to that path. So it's really a deep privilege to be able to sit here and speak to you as a collective. So thank you for having me. I'm going to spend this evening's time that we have together focused on this topic of self-actualization and self-transcendence. And I'll define those as we go along. I have a good chunk of material to cover in what really feels like a very small amount of time. So bear with me as I offer what I hope is a lot and a lot to send you off to sleep with and to reflect on. I would like to, however, start with a poem yet again. It is integrated for a lot of reasons into my work, and one of the reasons that I love poetry so much is that we can learn a lot from what I'll say the left brain, the kind of mental understanding of experience. But poetry brings us into the heart, brings us into the right brain, brings us into a felt sense. And we can even look at a poem in many different ways. We might study a poem and study it from its component parts or the stanzas or why did they choose that word. But when we allow ourselves to feel the entirety of the words of a poem, just like a symphony of music, we get moved in a way that sometimes takes us beyond words. So the poem I've chosen for tonight is called We Look with Uncertainty, and it ties a little bit to what we were speaking about last night for those of you that were here when we kind of leaned into a little bit of the power of being with not knowing. We look with uncertainty, and this is by Anne Hillman. We look with uncertainty beyond the old choices for clear-cut answers to a softer, more permeable aliveness, which is at every moment at the brink of death. For something new is being born in us if we but let it. We stand at a new doorway, awaiting that which comes, daring to be human creatures, vulnerable to the beauty of existence, learning to love. We stand at a new doorway, awaiting that which comes, daring to be human creatures, vulnerable to the beauty of existence, learning to love. when speaking about resilience and post-traumatic growth, sometimes we might think that these are only the outcome of our practices, but I really like to think of this as a process in itself that does indeed lead to some outcomes. And it's important to recognize that being resilient doesn't mean that we are immune to life's hardships. We will still experience difficulty. It's part of the human experience, yeah? Suffering is inevitable. But or what is it? Pain, I don't know. What's the quote? The pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. It's something. But you know what I mean, right? There is a way in which we can turn towards the inevitable challenges that we will face in life with greater ease. And that's really the point of this. But the path to resilience is about cultivating this capacity to respond effectively to our difficult experiences. So, as a process, when we're building our resilience, we are learning to be with our vulnerable emotions, and we learn to seek support. We learn actually to reach out for connection, recognizing that we don't have to be with our vulnerable experiences by ourselves. We've been speaking certainly during the daytime programs about the importance of social connection. And last night we spoke about how we're wired for connection. We're biologically really need that for a sense of belonging and safety and well-being. And we learn to challenge some of those negative thoughts or beliefs and explore meaning-making practices through the cultivation of a coherent narrative. And we're going to define that coherent narrative a little bit more along the way this evening. We're going to build those resources, the resources that are within us, so that we have resource of clear mind, that we have resource of being able to access compassion, to really reflect on where our mind goes and have more choice about the kinds of thoughts that we're having. And resources of emotional capacity, that we can be with more of ourselves and feel more integrated, less separated or fragmented inside of ourselves. And then we also build the resources around us, resources of community and resources of nature and resources of our pets. We cultivate a sense of our own embodiment, and as a result, we build some of that Agni, we build some of that sense of power, of connection, of strength, of empowerment. And we learn to transform learned helplessness into learned optimism. We spoke the other day about Marty Seligman and his impact in the world with the development of positive psychology and the science of flourishing. But where his work started was with learned helplessness and recognizing the impact of ongoing adversities. For example, if you imagine an animal that's being held in a cage, but the door is open, but every time the animal tries to leave the cage, the animal gets a shock. Eventually, the animal will stop trying to leave. And when we as humans have experienced adversity and challenge and trauma and more challenge, there's a time in which maybe we too have felt like, what's the point of trying? I'm just going to get knocked down again. And one of the most powerful teachings that I think Marty Seligman's life work has taught us is how his work really studied how we come out of learned helplessness. And he calls it, in the human experience, cultivating learned optimism. But there's something very important about this word optimism, especially in a world that contains ongoing challenges, as we all know are happening in our world on a regular basis right now. And that optimism needs to also be grounded in realism. That we're not speaking about a kind of optimism that is hope alone, or some kind of Pollyanna-ish denial of what's around us. That this kind of optimism looks at the challenges and helps us really decide how do we navigate those challenges in a way that is most effective, most beneficial to our being. And I personally feel that the compassion-based practices are one of our greatest assets in this work, in the sense that we can create a container through compassion practices that helps us turn towards our suffering, our pain, or that within our community in a way that embraces and therefore transforms through the power of the heart. When we look at resilience or post-traumatic growth as an outcome, we are recognizing very often that we have a greater sense of choice about what we think, choice about how we respond to our environment, and that we're living more in the here and now, so we have that sense of choice. We have a greater sense of freedom, right? We can perhaps stand and say, I'm no longer defined by the past. That doesn't mean that we won't in some ways still be impinged upon by the challenges that are in our present environment. There was a really beautiful question. I can't see where you're sitting out there, but there was a beautiful question that came up today around, but what if my present circumstances are still, filled with not having a choice and not having the ability to really live the life that I want? And I think that, sometimes when we begin to really wake up to ourselves and to what our truth is, we do start to confront the ways that some of our life circumstances are not in alignment with that. And sometimes we can identify and get clearer about some of the changes or the choices that we need to make in order to create a greater alignment between the inner awareness or the inner truth and our outer circumstances, so that there's a better match. And sometimes that takes time, and it requires a lot of self-compassion when we're in those scenarios that we don't have the power to change quite yet. We cultivate as as an outcome of our resilience practices, the capacity for greater psychological flexibility. This is the capacity to think about things in different ways, to reflect upon our life circumstances, and to not just get fixed or stuck in one way of believing or one way of thinking about ourselves, our circumstances, our future. And that comes with greater ease rather than effort. And we explore meaning through the cultivation of, again, a coherent narrative, and we'll come back around to that again. Perhaps we can say, these challenging events, they happened, but they're over now. And I'm strong and capable of handling challenge with support. And sometimes we have to say, these challenges are still here, but I know how to navigate them now. And we ultimately come away with a greater capacity to accept the world as imperfect as it is, and to take part in creating a meaningful change for an improved future. When we look at some of the signs and signals, I'll even call them symptoms of post-traumatic growth, right? I was sharing yesterday about post-traumatic growth, and I asked for a show of hands. How many of you have heard of post-traumatic growth? Some hands. How many of you have heard about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder? All of us. And that, when we know what to look for when we're looking for post-traumatic stress. I'm not sleeping, I'm not digesting, I'm worrying, I'm thinking worst case scenario thoughts about the future, I'm vigilant in my surroundings, I can't rest in my body, I'm avoiding people or places that might be reminders of the trauma. Those are all symptoms that we might identify as signals of post-traumatic stress. But if we don't know how to recognize the signs of post-traumatic growth, we might not see it. So how do we know if we're growing? We're orienting to our strengths. We recognize The changes, the positive changes in our interpersonal relationships, they're happening with greater ease. There's greater warmth that's being exchanged. We're better able to communicate what our needs are to others, and therefore we have a greater chance of having our needs met by others. We have an increased willingness to ask for and accept help. We experience an increased willingness to be vulnerable, an increased recognition of some of the social supports that had been previously ignored. I was sharing in one of the daytime talks about the experience that we had in our Boulder community in 2013 when we had a 500-year flood, and every house in our neighborhood flooded, including my own, and some houses were hit with an entire floor, being filled with water, all of people's personal items floating around, sometimes sewage entering the homes that got caught in mudslides because we had had fires the year before. And even though we lost material items, we had to, remove carpet and drywall and fix our house and all of the things that can be tragic when we have an event like that. What I remember more than any of those items that we lost or any of that hard time was the connections that we made with our neighbors, the ways that we worked together. We fed each other. We brought wet vacuums to each other's houses. We brought fans to each other's houses. We shared dumpsters. We carried things out of each other's houses. And I met neighbors that I never even knew I had. Okay. So, and we see these same kinds of efforts and comings together around the world when tragedies happen. People show up for each other and come out with that kindness and compassion. So we want to look for that in ourselves and within our communities, because not only do we ourselves go through phases of post-traumatic growth, but communities can also come out stronger. We might notice that we have an increased appreciation of life, an increased ability to take it easy. Maybe it's newly found interests or passions, or sometimes traumatic events can initiate spiritual practice, a longing for deeper spiritual meaning making, and can take one on a completely new path in life. As I was just naming with the story of the flood in our community, resilience can be a contributor to collective healing. It's not just about us personally, but it's also about drawing on our own personal resilience to serve others as we share the insights and wisdom gained along our own personal journeys. Resilience helps communities pull together to emerge stronger from tragedy. And resilience helps neighborhoods and cities to be better prepared to withstand catastrophic events, such as acts of violence or natural disasters like floods or fires. One of the other experiences that we had in our personal community, in our Boulder community, was that we had a shooting that occurred in our local grocery store, the grocery store that our family shops at, that we know the people that work there and so forth. When those unexpected events happen, it shakes you. It says, my goodness, we never thought that could happen in the Boulder bubble. That's what we call Boulder, because it feels so protected. How could this happen here? And, unfortunately, in the United States, there are so many of these kinds of events that happen in schools and synagogues and community centers, and it's tragic. It is tragic. And these, again, are moments where we need to know how to come together and to be willing to take what we practice, perhaps on the meditation cushion or on the mat, and really bring those same tools and skills of compassion and kindness and willingness to listen and willingness to help out toward each other. I've been speaking about meaning making. Meaning making is very much about the way that we try and come to terms with the lack of reason or the senselessness that can surround these kinds of acts of violence or the kinds of abuse that can happen, even abuse of children. And we are not saying that all these things happen for a reason. I think sometimes those kinds of messages that there is some inherent meaning to harmful acts can be very damaging. What we're really saying is that meaning is ultimately what happens inside of you as a person. It's how you personally commit to the task of working through despair to find a sense of hope for the future. I often think of meaning making as more the question of how do I cultivate a meaningful life? How do I live a life filled with meaning and purpose? What would be fulfilling for me? What at the end of my life could I look back and say, yes, I lived a good, fulfilling life? When we think about attending to trauma, attending to the past, the goal is to restructure the role that trauma has played in your life and in turn to lessen its emotional impact. With support, you can process the emotions, the sensations, the memories, and the beliefs associated with adverse or challenging events. By working through your past, you free yourself from the negative beliefs, emotions, and somatic experiences associated with these events. And we can learn to trust that by releasing the remnants of the painful past, that it can allow for new growth. When I wrote the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook, and I know that one is in our bookstore here, the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook follows a hero's journey arc or a heroine's journey arc, and we can talk a little bit about the nuances of the two of those if we'd like. But there's a great wisdom, and I'll speak here to some of the work of Joseph Campbell in his contributions of understanding the hero's journey, both as a mythology. It's something that we see across many great movies and that we might watch and so forth. But we also can see this in ourselves. And when we start to recognize ourselves as the hero or heroine of our own life journey, it empowers us to be self-responsible, not alone in that self-responsibility, but self-responsible for how we are shaping and moving through the challenges that we will inevitably face. So very often, our hero's journey starts with a phase of innocence, but sometimes that innocence can't even be found within our own lifetime experience because some of us are born into traumatizing environments right from the in utero environment or birth traumas or being born into families where there is abuse or strife that's happening. So sometimes this concept of a phase of innocence, well, that didn't happen for me. And maybe we need to go further back, even generations back, until we can find what sometimes we refer to as a well ancestor who can represent that phase of innocence. Maybe it's a pre-birth moment before we incarnated into this lifetime. Or perhaps you yourself have a location, a time, a place in this lifetime of that phase of freedom, a phase of ease. And then in our hero's journey arc, there is what we call the call. This is a time in which that period of ease is disrupted by loss or trauma, whether that happened to you directly or maybe it happened to your parents or to your grandparents. We can sometimes see many callings to do trauma work because they may have happened at several locations and times. And very often there's an initial urge to reject that call because it is scary to go toward that felt sense of trauma, the pain, the experience of the fear that we might have felt, or the fear that our bones know, the fear that our guts know. It's very, very hard to turn toward that. And so it's not uncommon to have some phase in our own hero's journey in which we want to avoid anything having to do with that. We might get caught up in addictions, substance use, binge watching your TV show, right? Whatever it might be, isolating ourselves, disconnecting from yourself, because to turn directly toward that pain requires a tremendous amount of resource. And so that would be the next phase, to gather your resources, to gather your team of allies, to seek out the mentors, to seek out the community that is going to help you be with that pain, that discomfort. And once we have a tipping point of sufficient resource within ourselves and with access to that around ourselves, we are able to cross the threshold. We commit ourselves to the healing path. Now, I'm going to guess that everyone here in this room has hit that threshold. We are here having committed ourselves to the healing path. It's profound, right? I think that very often before we arrive at that point, we can sometimes have many years of what we'll call ambivalence, right? Like one step over the threshold, one step back. Not so sure about this. And maybe some of us here are still in some of that ambivalence of, am I really ready to give up whatever it might be that, the substance, the alcohol, the lifestyle choices that are maybe keeping me moving back and forth across that threshold. And this is where the journey begins, but doesn't end, right? There's a deep stepping in at that point, but then we have what we would call the descent into the underworld. Joseph Campbell referred to this as the cave you fear to enter. We might also call this shadow work. It's the time in which we do that deep inner work of trauma recovery. We're, in a sense, confronting the inner demons, right? And we're doing that deep work because it's going to allow us to retrieve the treasures. Those treasures being the strength, the courage, the wisdom, the compassion, the clarity, the self-awareness, the self-realization. And then there's a phase that we would call the return. And this is so important, right? The return is when we come back around full circle, back to our community, so that we can share our discovered gifts and capacities. I remember for myself a moment of realization that the support that I had to do my deep inner work was not just so that I could kind of go like, yay, I've achieved that for myself. It was a moment to realize, oh, I'm meant to bring this out to others, right? Like that is a deep honoring of our own journey, and it's a deep honoring of our communities, right? You can think about how many groups of people around the world, we can even think of our indigenous cultures where someone might go on vision quest, someone might go into, a solo journey into the wilderness, and when they come back, there's stories to be told, there's deep wisdom, there's deep insight. And that is not just for their own sake, their own well-being, but it's deeply needed by the community, right? The community is hungry for each of our wisdom-seeking journeys, if that's the inner journey or if it's the outer journey. And this is another term from Joseph Campbell. He describes this phase of the hero's journey as becoming the master of two worlds. The master of two worlds, where we are ultimately able to maintain a connection to the inner spiritual self while also compassionately relating to this complex world that we share. So, some of us here, for many, many important reasons, live here, reside within the ashram life. And I envision you as anchors that call those of us that don't live here in, so that we can benefit from the generation of the energy that is existing here. We can, in a sense, kind of soak our cloth in the vibration of ashram living, so that we can be filled with this. And the majority of us walk back out into the world, and it's our task to actually share this, to bring what we cultivate in practice out into the grocery store, the bank, the parenting of our children, our workplaces, and so forth. And then there's self-actualization and self-transcendence. And we're going to define those here in the next few slides, where the final phases are really about the self-leadership that allows you to become the leader, the healer, and perhaps the guide for others. And this doesn't have to be so grandiose. Everyone doesn't have to write a book or sit on a stage, right? Like, you're going to find your own calling. We all have our callings, and sometimes that is to be the best parent that you can be, to break the cycle of trauma that has been in your lineage. Sometimes that is to be the really kind community member that always has butter and sugar to share with your neighbors. Awakening to your potential is the process of fulfilling your own personal, if you want to call it dharma, your own personal vows, your sacred sankalpa, your sacred promise to the world, becoming who you really are and who you were always meant to be. It's about integrating the wounds that may have once been a source of shame or confusion, and reclaiming a sense of dignity that allows you to walk in the world with the knowledge that you are so much more than your trauma or your pain. You learn to create a meaningful life by living in alignment with your values. There is a book by Viktor Frankl that's not the one that we perhaps many of us have read, but it's a book called The Doctor and the Soul. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that book, but one of the things that he speaks about in this book is about the role of values, living with your creative values, living within alignment of your mindset values, and so forth. And when we bring our values into action, it connects us to our core, our strength, our stability. There is some way when we know what our values are, we know who we are. And we become this unshakable force where we can walk through the world. And we're going to get lots of projections when we walk into the world. It's just human nature. People are going to see in you who they want to see. And they might project onto you what they don't like in themselves. Maybe they project that onto you. Maybe they project on their own pain onto you. And when you are living in alignment with your own value self, you become unshakable because you can stay differentiated between what somebody else is putting on you and the knowledge of who you really are. And that's deep, true power. And we have this sense of congruence that we are increasing our well-being because we start to decrease the discrepancies between our values and our actions. So an example of that decrease in discrepancy is we might have a deep value for spiritual living, but we might not have a lifestyle outside of the ashram that allows for that. Maybe we don't make the time for meditation. Maybe we don't make the time for a yoga practice. And so if we have a value of spiritual lifestyle, we might need to reduce that discrepancy by really rearranging our life so that we make sure that we have those practices and time for those practices. Now the next slide, just warning you ahead of time, has a lot of words on it. And you might take a moment to look at this list of words and see if there's one or two or three, there might be more, that jump out at you. If it's hard to read them way back there, I won't read them all, but I'll pull a few of them out. Accountability, creativity, community, forgiveness, fairness, generativity, hopefulness, integrity, justice, nature, love of learning. You all get that. You all get a stamp for love of learning tonight. Open-mindedness, stewardship, I love that word, spiritual reflection, wisdom, well-being. And I'll invite you to take some time on your own, and this practice is also in the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook, where you can take some time to reflect on your values and how you might ensure that your life is in alignment with them. For the sake of our time tonight, I want to share just a few more slides with you, and then we'll close out in our time tonight. Self-actualization. We become more human when we focus on loving another, when we focus on loving another person, when we focus on serving a cause that is greater than ourselves. And again, quoting from Viktor Frankl. Self-actualization is not about being better than someone else. It's not about being perfect. It's about being yourself, honestly, wholeheartedly, authentically you. And it can take time. It can take time, right? We might go through a long phase of not quite knowing yet who we are, and that's okay too. And there is something profound around that, what I will call arriving, or even an arriving home to yourself, where there's a tipping point of all of the practices, the deep inner work, the therapy, all that we do to arrive at that clarity of who I really am and our values and who you really are, in which it becomes easier to walk through the world in that unshakable core. And I mentioned that I would speak for a moment about self-actualization and how that can roll into self-transcendence. Maslow viewed self-actualization as a rite of passage that allows us to go beyond the single self into self-transcendence. If we think of self-actualization perhaps as filling our own potential, self-transcendence is about furthering a cause beyond the self, and it's developed within a greater desire to protect the welfare of all people. Our last slide for tonight is a reverence, a deep resonance of where Maslow's work in defining self-actualization and self-transcendence came from. And I had a deep honor of teaching this program some years ago, and one of the attendees of the program, a resident in Canada, shared with me about Maslow's connection and time studying with the Blackfoot Nation, and requested that in reparations to the Blackfoot Nation, that I include in my teachings how Maslow's original research came from studying with these indigenous peoples, and that in some ways Maslow mistranslated some of the work, that we have this image in the West of self-actualization being the peak of a triangle. And honestly, when I look at the original work of the Blackfoot Nation and the original concept of this, it's much more aligned with our yogic philosophies, because it's a circular model and it's not a triangle representing independency as a key component of self-actualization. Rather, there is a recognition within these communities that we are born self-actualized. We're born already whole. And that it's not an achievement. It's not an achievement. That our relationship is essential. Our relationship, to the land is essential. To each other is essential. It's much more of an interdependency with nature, with each other, that allows for this experience. And so often as a yogi, I feel that much of what we are up to, much of what we're about, is moving through and clearing and clarifying the layers that are the obstructions between that deep inner knowing of our true nature, of our true self. And that in many ways, this is much more in alignment with that. And the last piece that I'll name about this is that this particular perspective also comes with great reverence for our ancestors, that our actions are available to us because of the generations that preceded us. And Also with the recognition that our actions have repercussions, consequences, and our legacies that we leave behind, they're the seeds that we plant for the generations that come after us. And so we locate ourselves in a much larger pattern of interdependence. So thank you. It's really a pleasure to be able to offer these talks in this space. Thank you. I don't know if there's anyone that has a comment or question. I'm happy to take a few. We've got one right up here.
As I shared earlier today, you being here for me is a miracle. So thank you so much for your knowledge and your wisdom shared. It resonates deeply with me, and the term of post-traumatic growth is totally new to me and opens a whole new world, as you say, instead of focusing on the symptoms. My question is, if self-sabotage and self-denial was always the strategy to stay safe, it's so very difficult to overcome. I do feel I have so much to give and a lot of wisdom gained on my own healing journey of trauma, of chronic fatigue.
Yeah.
And yet, to overcome the fear of my own brilliance, or my own competence, or my own being, actually, is so deeply ingrained. And I do struggle so much with that.
Yeah. It's a powerful story that you're sharing, and it's one that in itself, what you're describing to me as I hear it is the accumulation of a lot of wound that has developed into very strong patterns. We might call them samskaras, right? They're very, very strong patterns inside. And the experience of how that's wound into the physiology, as you name chronic fatigue, and the experience of how it's wound its way through behavior and habit. And we don't want to pull on those strings too much too fast, or we end up getting what I often refer to as the rubber band effect of I expand into my brilliance and then I contract back into my fear. And I see you nodding like that's totally it, right?
Totally.
Yes. So it may take a lifetime to unwind, and it might take the next 5 years, or it might take a year. I don't know, right? Because often, and if we imagine this as a rope, the strands that are in that rope are strands from the ancestors, are strands from your upbringing, are strands of, again, all of these experiences, the collective traumas that wind their way in there. And so you might just work with one strand at a time, and as you loosen that, each one up, the rope gets a little bit wider, a little bit looser, not as tightly wound. And then there's here too a tipping point, a threshold, right? Where it becomes easier to unwind more of the strands from the rope. They become more like threads that are loosely woven. The other piece that I'll offer, and it's a metaphor that I have in the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook, and I might even just read a short quote from it, if I may, and we'll see if there's another question, but I feel like it's a lovely quote for us to perhaps tie into your question. This quote, for me, I bring it here because I feel like as we unwind those strands, they become fibers that we can now weave with. It's not that you're going to take all of this out of you and it's no longer of you, but you are more empowered to take the fibers that have informed who you are, and you get to actually recreate a new weave with them. So this is from the book. Over time, you take the many threads of your life experiences and weave them into a single fabric. You weave in your strengths and your struggles. You begin to notice patterns and themes. Most importantly, you recognize yourself now as the weaver. You learn that you can continue to integrate new threads at any time, for you are an active participant in the ongoing creation of your life story. Over time, this new fabric that you create out of your life experiences, it begins to feel increasingly integrated and whole. Now, your life story can help you identify new possibilities for your future. You might even discover that your fabric is inextricably woven with the fabric of all life. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So much appreciation for you and your work.
No, thank you. I appreciate your question. I feel like it was a deeply valuable question for our collective space. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right, we have another question back here.
Hi. I'm not, I haven't studied the hero's journey much or like learned too much about it, but my understanding of it in my own mind is that it's like a repetitive cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you had it laid out seemed less of that and more of like a progression from beginning to end.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned this. Very often, I actually name that we might have multiple cycles of this that we run through, and I didn't say that tonight. And I think that's a really beautiful piece because, especially tying that into the question that was just asked before you, we might have a round in which we go through that and we come out with like a golden nugget of wisdom, and then that is something that we bring to our community, and then we have another round that we go through and we have another golden thread. So thank you. It's a nice reminder.
Yeah, but like the master or the self-actualization piece seems very final, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
is it through that whole everything that you named there? Is it through the whole thing that we can return to the beginning again?
I think that we have multiple small returns, and I think we have, kind of layers of mastership that cultivate, and I do think that they accumulate. Like for each layer that we retrieve of ourselves, you can even think of it as kind of soul retrieval in a sense. Each time we go through a round, we have more of ourselves. More of myself is here. More of myself is here, and then perhaps there's a tipping point.
Thank you.
Thank you. All righty. Well, with deep gratitude and honoring of our time, we'll go ahead and hopefully sleep well with quiet environment. All right. And thank you.
I would like to thank very much Arielle Schwartz. Let's give her a big hand for this talk.